Rance is coming to Steam. I don't know what kind of monkey paw bullshit that required, but this is a huge win for this series, which has absolutely zero right to be as good as it is. A lot of you have been finding my Rance reviews since the news dropped, but for those who are unaware, what is Rance? It's a series of adult games by developer Alicesoft that started out as a parody of the fantasy genre, but eventually over the course of its nearly 30-year lifespan, evolved into a complex, interconnected comedy epic with surprisingly great writing and varied gameplay mechanics that completely changed from game to game. And the finale of the series, Rance 10 Showdown, at the time held the record for the largest video game script ever. But while the games are what people know Rance for, they're not all Rance has to offer. There are also two OVAs. I already reviewed 1993's Rance Saboku no Guardian, which was a unique story based on the original iteration of Rance. That one wasn't quite what I was expecting, but a great time all around. But the next OVA had a different approach. Rance OVA The Quest for Hikari is a 4-episode direct adaptation of the identically titled game, which itself is a complete remake of the original 1989 game. So the two main differences are that Rance OVA is not its own story, but a recreation of an existing one, and it's based on the canon timeline of Rance. What's that mean? Cliff Notes' explanation is that Alicesoft thought they were going bankrupt and rushed an ending to the series with Kichikuo Rance. They bounced back and later retconned Kichikuo Rance, continued the series from there, and remade or remastered the first few games. Now there's two timelines, the retro timeline and the canon timeline. Saboku no Guardian was based on the retro timeline, Rance OVA is an adaptation from the canon timeline. Hey, I'm not important enough to have sponsors yet, so instead let me quickly plug the Highlights channel. While videos on this channel usually take a ton of time to make, I'm uploading 3 times a week over on Ads Highlights in the meantime. Basically, anything stream related will probably end up on there at some point. I'd appreciate it if you could check it out. Okay, back to the video. So here's the thing about Rance. As I mentioned earlier, it started out as a pure parody of fantasy, with the main gimmick being that the valiant noble hero is a narcissistic, horny gremlin who is more than a little struggle snuggly. Over time, he retained those core elements to his character, but he was given more depth than you would expect, which was then taken into consideration when the Rance OVA remake was made, putting old Rance a bit more in line with the later games, while still following the plot of the original game, which was designed as an isolated adventure rather than the interconnected geopolitical epic we'd eventually get. I'm telling you this to kind of set the stage for how this story is structured, because it is actually pretty interesting on a writing level. It's not often that writers get a chance to substantially rework past stories to align with future visions. The plot of Rance OVA is pretty simple on its surface. We're in a medieval Magitech fantasy setting, and the hero Rance and his slave Syl are on a quest from the Adventurers Guild to go to the kingdom of Lysis to track down the titular Hikari, a noble girl who had gone missing. The remainder of the story is essentially one long trail of breadcrumbs and obstacles for Rance to traverse in order to find the girl and figure out what's going on, all while being pretty silly and with plenty of distractions along the way. Look, the game is an eroge and the OVA is a hentai. Do the math. I was very excited to watch the OVA because I liked the game and I love the series. But now that I've seen it, it's actually kinda difficult to properly review for one simple reason. It's as close to a one-to-one recreation of the game as you could possibly get in a 4-episode OVA, and there's not a whole lot I can say about the OVA that isn't just restating my opinions about the game. It follows the plot almost beat for beat, and the only substantial difference between the two is that the OVA cut out a bunch of side quests, likely due to time constraints. Though many of the characters do still show up in small supporting roles. The character designs are nearly identical to those of the game. Many of the funny scenes in the OVA are directly lifted from the game and use the same little jokes and gags like in the puppy stomping scene. It's not as disturbing as it sounds. The OVA uses the same detail of the puppy giving points and eventually one-ups as Rance is stomping on its head. The sex scenes, or H scenes as they're known in eroge, are all the same context and the same exact positions. The OVA even recreated a number of CGs from the game, which is the most fan-servicey thing I've ever seen in a direct adaptation. I was admittedly grinning like an idiot when I saw the scene where the ninja Kanami is holding a blade to Rance's throat, because I have strong memories of that exact visual from the game. But do you see the issue here? I could certainly talk about the plot, the characters, the humor, and the writing in general, but I've already made a video about the game. In fact, if my analytics are anything to go by, a decent amount of you watching this video found me through that exact video. The OVA is such an absurdly faithful adaptation that it doesn't do its own thing at all, really. So anything I say is just going to be a rehashing of my thoughts on the game, and I'd like to think I'm better than just padding my videos at the slightest excuse to do so. So I'm not going to do my typical review style, and instead focus on the few areas where the OVA is different from the game. If you want to know more about things like the plot and the absolutely amazing characters this series has to offer, check out my video on the Rance OVA game. I'll link it in the description below. So the first and most impactful thing about the OVA is that 4 episodes simply wasn't enough to adapt the entirety of Rance OVA without changes, especially considering how rigid the adaptation ended up being. That would have probably required around a full season's worth of runtime, give or take. The result was that side quests were cut and the pacing of the main plot got kinda fucked. Okay, let me be fair here. The pacing isn't actually that bad in the OVA, but it's noticeable just how much it keeps pushing the plot forward at a breakneck pace, in contrast to the game, which has a natural buffer in between major plot points, with not only gameplay, but a ton of silly dialogue, scenes with no goal in mind except to entertain you a bit, and a world to explore and take in. In the Rance games, the plot is only one part of the story, and you're not getting the full experience without all these little moments, witnessing everything from absurdist humor to serious character work. Things like the friendship between Manad, an ally to Rance, and Kanami, an enemy at the time, add a layer of complexity to the characters and the setting. Through immersion, you slowly begin to appreciate the weirdness of probably the most interesting Magitech fantasy setting I've ever seen. The OVA simply doesn't have any of that because there's just not enough time for it. I think I was at a massive advantage for having watched the OVA after already playing many of the games, because I was able to rely on my memories of the games to replace the bits of world building and character development that the OVA was forced to cut. Anyone going into the OVA without prior experience with the franchise will probably have a good enough time since it's funny, it is interesting, and it's not badly written. It's just not the full Rance experience. This issue is compounded by the related fact that most of the side content was completely cut out except for a few scenes that intertwine with the main plot, and a few little cameos from the skipped heroines that serve as Easter eggs for those who've played the games. The Rance OVA game was pretty janky with how the side content was implemented, and it's notorious for just how easy it is to accidentally fail quests if you don't have a guide warning you about the numerous arbitrary points of no return. But even with that hassle, the fact that there's so much side content is indicative of a core design philosophy in most of the games that I believe is important for Rance as a story. Rance is not a focused person. He's a horny little dipshit who thinks with his cock. It's true that in Rance OVA his goal is to rescue Hikari, but he gets distracted by every pair of tits that passes him by. He veers off course constantly. The side quests are essentially a ludonarrative representation of that mindset. You doing a bunch of random shit for a side quest to unlock an H scene with one of the characters is pretty much exactly how Rance would behave. Hell, one of them requires grinding money to buy an item that costs the same as the reward Rance will eventually get for rescuing Hikari. When Rance sees a path that leads to vagina, he fucking takes it and follows it through to the end. The OVA does not display this at all. Rance is the kind of guy who will go to extreme lengths if it means getting the chance to fuck a cute girl, but the OVA's more focused approach to the plot frames him as more reactive than proactive. Rather than pursuing the girls around him, he doesn't really stray from the main path and simply takes advantage of the opportunities that happen to come his way. I understand that there isn't really any solution to this issue since 4 episodes just isn't enough time, but I was left disappointed as a result. Another thing that kinda surprised me is that the sex scenes, while not particularly bad, are easily my least favorite part of the OVA, and on reflection, it's pretty easy to say why. For starters, the music just doesn't work. The first couple of scenes have no music whatsoever, and the rest have basically the hentai equivalent of elevator music. I obviously can't show you what I'm talking about, but at no point does the music ever seem to fit the scene it's attached to. I'm sorry, but generic soft piano behind a high-energy scene that's specifically meant to be over the top for comedic effect just isn't a good choice. In fact, more often than not, the music only ever served to make the various scenes a little uncomfortable for me to watch. The dissonance between the audio and the visuals felt wrong, and if it wasn't for me making this video, I'd probably have skipped over most of them entirely. I mean, the big climactic scene against the main antagonist is memorable in the game partly due to some pretty spot-on comedic trope subversion, but also because it's coupled with Rance's triumphant character theme, My Glorious Days. It's funny and ridiculous, and even after years, it still lives rent-free in my head. The OVA gives that exact same scene some jazzy fucking elevator music. It's just not the same, it doesn't work. At least they play My Glorious Days at the very end of the OVA, but it was such a missed opportunity all around. In fact, the sex scenes in general, despite being lifted straight from the games in terms of context and position, don't really feel like Rance scenes at all. Instead, they kinda play out like a typical hentai scene with the goal of getting you off. While that's definitely an element of the H scenes from the game, there's more to it than that. Unless the scene is deliberately trying to make you uncomfortable, there's nearly always an air of silliness. The original Rance was a parody after all. It's meant to be sexy, but it's also meant to be kind of absurd. The valiant hero should not be acting like this, and it's funny how he goes so overboard. Rance says funny things, there's sometimes banter back and forth. Sometimes the scenes facilitate actual character development. The OVA pretty clearly had a single goal in mind with these scenes, and it feels like a waste to me. Though to be fair, there is one exception. There's one scene in which Rance gives Syl, who is usually a very submissive person, a temporary personality change with magic. She then becomes rather aggressive and takes command of the situation, and there is an H scene to go along with that. Afterwards, she says, "I finally did it the way I wanted to, in this absolutely euphoric tone." This is an excellent moment in the broader dynamic going on between Rance and Syl. Syl is in love with Rance, and while he does love her deep down, he rarely expresses it and regularly mistreats her. And when they have sex, it's always at Rance's say-so and usually done in a way that inconveniences or embarrasses Syl in some way. With his personality changing spell, Syl finally got to do it with Rance on her terms, and it made her unbelievably happy. That one line, building on an otherwise straightforward sex scene, says so much about these two. And it's a shame that this was pretty much the only time I actually appreciated one of the H scenes in the OVA. Now look, I know I've been kinda shitting on the OVA so far, but it's not all bad. There is one thing that I think it does quite well, and that's the spectacle. The game told a story visual novel style, meaning that outside gameplay segments, the story's significant feats of strength or magic were CGs, or maybe sprites with keyframe animation. The OVA clearly didn't have the budget for a super high intensity fight scene, but they did come up with a pretty elegant alternative. They leaned super hard into the anime bullshit, and I fucking love it. A lot of the characters in the Rance universe are really overpowered. Even Rance OVA, which has probably the least overpowered cast in the entire series, is still kind of overpowered. So when they do their thing, they'll have these crazy wind-ups as they prepare to do their special moves. Characters will jump in the air and there will be like 10 seconds of them coming down as the scene around them pops and ramps up the intensity. When Syl finally casts magic for the first time, the whole area is flooded with a blinding white light before things go boom. It doesn't have the technical prowess of a high-budget shonen series, but it really sells the impact of the blows and blasts while also showcasing some of the ridiculousness that perfectly meshes with the kind of story that Rance is. For all my criticisms of the OVA, I really did appreciate this. The Rance OVA is not as bad as I've been making it sound in this video. It's just that most of the ways that it differs from the game are to its detriment, which is extra pronounced when you consider how most of the OVA is deliberately cloning the game. But as an experience, it's pretty enjoyable for the most part. I do wish it was better, but I had a good time nonetheless. In fact, I think the Rance 1 OVA could serve as a pretty reasonable entry point to the series. I still recommend playing the actual game, and it's definitely more complete in terms of its story, but I do acknowledge that early Rance can be a bit of a tough sell considering how janky and frustrating most of the older games can be, including 01 and 02. The OVA will at least give you a baseline for the most important characters from the first game, and will serve as a decent introduction to the wider world. So if you're curious about Rance but are hesitant about the games, consider checking the OVA out. I obviously can't share any links, but it's easy enough to find with a Google search. And if you're a seasoned Rance veteran, I'd still recommend it because it's a fun time despite its issues. At the end of the day, I have my complaints, but I'm glad I took the time to watch it. Thanks for watching. The second half of my version of the Anime Men's tier list is still being worked on, it's just taken a bit longer than expected due to a variety of real-life stuff that's been happening. Nothing serious, but my time has been more limited than usual these past few weeks. Rest assured that progress is being made, and I'll hopefully have it out before too long. After that, I've got way too many videos that I really want to make, so I've got motivation. Big thank you to my members, especially my $10 members Bulk Squat Thrust, President Irina Vladimirovna Putina, and Robert Lay. If you'd like to join them and get early access to future videos for as little as $1 a month, click the join button down below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more, and leave your thoughts in the comments. All that helps me out more than you'd think. And don't forget the Highlights channel that has 3 uploads a week, so there's content for you there. Different content, but content nonetheless. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Play the Electro Swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more.